The land that became known to the United States in 1787 as the Northwest Territory held no such title within the minds of the region's native inhabitants, who knew of this land for centuries only as their home. The native tribes of this region soon had to face the dispiriting realities of what American settlement would entail for the future of their people. Many of these native tribes challenged the American claims that had been placed upon their lands, and were quick to take up hostile dispositions towards the settlers that had migrated there. As a result, armed conflict plagued the region. Feelings of uneasiness and intense concern swept through the minds of the Indians, who were uncertain as to what these American pressures would mean for the future well-being of their people. While some native groups found conforming to American culture to be beneficial as well as economically necessary, others considered it a great evil and threat to their Indian identities. With their futures in mind, these people were forced to decide what path they would begin upon. They knew that the paths of their ancestors were becoming obstructed by the declining game and their growing dependence upon American traders for firearms and other trade goods, including alcohol. At this time, many tribes found that their traditional ways were no longer sufficient in providing them with the necessary means of survival, let alone prosperity. Many Indians began taking up Euro-American styles of farming, trade, education, and religion as a means of coping with their changing world. Among these tribes, willing to conform to American ways, were the Shawnees settled at Wapakoneta under the guidance of Chief Blackhoof. Wapakoneta at this time became a center for American influence as well as American Indian relations. Blackhoof's accommodating and loyal attitudes towards the United States could be seen both in the way of life that he took part in and promoted at Wapakoneta, as well as in the supportive efforts that he displayed towards the United States at the councils held both before and during the war in 1812. Those tribes who stood opposed to American influence, however, participated in a new Indian movement, one that granted them with the sense of guidance and security that they had been looking for during this time of utter uncertainty. This new movement was born out of the spiritual beliefs and guidance of the Shawnee prophet Tenskwatawa, and was in later years headed by the staunch and unrelenting political drive of his brother, Tecumseh. The influence of this movement was as much widespread in geographic scope as it was deeply ingrained into the history of this time, from its most early developments at the turn of the century up until the outbreak of the war itself in 1812. The Shawnee prophet Tenskwatawa set out to convince the people of all Indian tribes to purify their lives of American corruption and to reunite through the traditional customs and values of their ancestors. In 1805, Tenskwatawa set up a community of followers at Greensville, Ohio, as well as another later at Prophetstown, Indiana, in 1809. According to the prophet, the Master of Life had spoken to him in a vision, where he stated that the Americans I did not make. They are not my children, but the children of an evil spirit. And since the evil spirit of the great serpent lived in the water, it was only natural that the Americans first appeared on the eastern seashore, arriving from the great serpent's home. They are unjust, he explained. They have taken away your lands, which were not made for them. Statements of this nature, as well as the rising popularity of the movement itself, sparked intense anxieties in the minds of U.S. officials, who feared that the formation of another Indian Confederacy would topple their hopes and motivations as they moved towards war with Great Britain. In the years closely preceding the outbreak of the war in 1812, the peaceful and spiritual nature of the movement became overshadowed as the prophet's brother, Tecumseh, took the reins, steering the movement down a more political and militant path. Tecumseh set out towards his goal of regaining and protecting native Indian land and sovereignty. The movement's influence brought about great divides within many of the larger and more powerful Indian tribes throughout the region, such as the Miamis, Wyandottes, and Delawares. U.S. officials developed a keen concern for the movement at this time, as their fear of British Indian alliances was quickly becoming more of a reality. The hostilities that continued on the frontier between Indian tribes and American settlers further heightened the tension between the two groups throughout the region. One attack in particular, which resulted in the deaths of two frontiersmen near the Indian settlement at Wapakoneta, fueled the United States' distrust for these tribes, as they failed to bring forward the tribesmen who were responsible for the murders. It was during this time that John Johnston was appointed Indian agent and transferred from Fort Wayne to a farm settlement in Piqua, Ohio, to try and ease the tensions that were arising out of the region. In March of 1812, Johnston wrote to Senator Worthington of Ohio, explaining to him that a council with the native tribes would be beneficial to both sides with war approaching. In his letter, Johnston predicted that there would be 3,000 Indians in attendance and that the council would last for 16 days. The success of a council meeting that Johnston held with the neighboring tribes prior to this request left him hopeful that another meeting would help bring about peaceful relations with the tribes that would attend. The War Department sent out a letter to all Indian agents, announcing that the war with Great Britain had been declared. The agents were told to stay alert and to do whatever they could to keep the Indians throughout the region peaceful. President James Madison took particular interest in the council meeting at Piqua. He explained in a letter to the U.S. officials stationed there that any British-Indian alliances would surely be detrimental to the ultimate outcome of the war for the United States, and that Indian neutrality shall therefore be held as the ultimate goal of the council. President Madison explained that the government officials were to propose to the Indian tribes that as long as they remained neutral in the war, that the United States would continue to grant them with the support and supplies that they had been guaranteed. Madison explained that any tribe that was unwilling to adhere to these guidelines would immediately lose all aid as well as any rights that they had previously had to their land. It was at this time, during the month preceding the council's commencement in August, that the prophet Tenskwatawa visited Fort Wayne, where he met with Indian agent Benjamin Stickney, and expressed to him that he had refused to take up arms against the United States, and that he was willing to keep his tribesmen at Prophetstown neutral in the war. Tenskwatawa also assured government officials there that he would convene at the council in Piqua alongside his brother in the next month. His promises, however, were not to be trusted. While staying at the fort, Tenskwatawa had received a secret messenger who had been carrying a large red wampum belt, signifying the king's great broad axe and a British-Indian alliance in the war. The messenger relayed Tecumseh's message to rally the warriors at Prophetstown for an attack on the United States in the coming days. Just days before the council occurred, word of General Hull's surrender at Fort Detroit reached the government officials at Piqua. The news left them fearful of the effects that the loss would surely have on the attendance and outcome of the council meeting in the coming days. When the council commenced on August 15, 1812, the government officials were disheartened to find that only 700 of the projected 3,000 Indians had chosen to take the path to Piqua to confirm their neutrality in the war. Several of the tribes that were expected to convene at the council declined and sent letters to the government officials expressing the reasons for not attending. One of these tribal leaders was the Wyandot chief Tarhi, who in his speech stated,
"Brothers, listen to the reason of my not attending to the council fire of the 17 United States, of the great misfortune that has passed the principal of nations and chiefs, which received at the Big Rock. The British has done too much here. Brother, I hope you will now listen to me, that you will immediately send unto me men to build a garrison large enough to hold the Wyandots and Senecas at my town, Upper Sandusky. Brothers, you promised me that as soon as you heard from me, that you would rise up and assist us."
After hearing of the recent defeats at Fort Dearborn and Detroit, a delegation of Miami Indians en route to Piqua also decided not to attend the council, and instead decided to return back to Fort Wayne to deliberate on where they would choose to stand in the war. Many of the other tribes that had not convened held similar opinions to those of the Potawatomi chief Gomo, who in his letter expressed that he was unwilling to take his people down the path to Piqua due to their belief that the United States would attempt to negotiate for his people's lands. Of the 700 Indians that came to Piqua that August, it was documented that there were 590 Shawnees, over 100 Mingos, 26 Ottawas, and 25 Kickapoos. The Shawnees, under the guidance of Blackhoof, had come to Piqua in search of protection from the British and the other Indian tribes that had become hostile towards them in the recent months. Blackhoof expressed his tribe's stance in the war in a speech which he presented before the council, where he stated that
they disclaimed any intention of joining the British in the war, declared their fixed determination to remain neutral and to preserve their friendship with the United States. The British viewed the Indians as their dogs, that when they told them to bite, they must bite, but that they had determined to act for themselves, that at the Treaty of Greenville they had made a lasting peace. To that treaty they are resolved to adhere. They there buried the tomahawk, or threw it into the sea, never to be raised again. They said that they were thankful for the offer made of protection, but at present knew of no enemy, with whom they were not able to contend.
At the Council's close on September 7, 1812, the U.S. Commissioners concluded that the Delawares, Shawnees, Wyandots, and Senecas that were in attendance would remain neutral in the war. Apart from these tribes, the Commissioners recognized the Miamis, Winnebagos, and Potawatomis as hostile, and agreed to suspend all prior assistance and land agreements that they once had with these tribes. Although peaceful relations were preserved into the war with those Shawnees, Delawares, and Wyandots who had promised to remain neutral, the Indian attacks on Fort Wayne and Fort Harrison in that same month illuminated the shortcomings of the council held at Piqua. As a result of these attacks, Secretary of War William Henry Harrison responded with violent force, sending bands of U.S. military to the Wabash-Maumee region, where tribal villages along the Eel, Miami, and Wabash were burned and destroyed. These attacks set the final stage for an all-out war between the United States and the British Indian alliances throughout the frontier, a war that paved the way for American expansion west and that ultimately set the Indians of the region on a dead-end path away from what they once knew as an Indian identity and away from what they once knew as their home.